Well, hello, welcome, weary traveller, to my modest country estate, or if you are a representative of His Majesty's Customs and Revenue Office, to my terraced house in Scunthorpe. Please do pop yourself down onto one of the chairs, pick up a pair of the comfortable slippers off the shelf, and pour yourself a wee something from the bottle. For those of you who may not have been here before, my name is Lord Hardthrasher, and I will be your guide today as we delve into the story of the Chindits in the Second World War. This story is really quite extraordinary for a number of reasons, not all of them wholly positive if I'm honest, and thus I've decided to dedicate 2 whole videos to them because... Oh, hang on, let me just reject that. There we are. Sorry, yes, where was I? Oh yes, why 2 videos? Well, it's an amazing story, worth telling in full, and also because it helps to pay for the repairs of the east wing of the new build in Scunthorpe. What's that, Jenkins? Really? Oh, how many rooms do they normally have? Really? Not even a scullery? Where do the servants sleep? I see. Well, okay, look, it's a bit late now. Everybody knows you can't edit this stuff. Hang on, bloody hell. Flipping phone is going off again. Where was I? Yes, sorry. Information. Information you don't want getting out and playing the bills. As you know, I very rarely do adverts on this channel. In fact, I've only ever done one for the Floaty Sinky Thing company, who very kindly helped me to save poor Jenkins's delicate hands by replacing my automatic mangle some time ago. But today's video is sponsored by Aura, a company specialising in protecting personal data. I'm doing this partly to assuage her ladyship's wrath, which we will come to in a minute, but mostly because some scurvy-suffering, pigeon-livered plonkers at a crypto company that have decided that I signed up for their super-duper, totally risk-free, absolutely not a scam, cryptocurrency trading platform, which, provided I invest absolutely everything I own immediately with them, is apparently going to make me a multi-millionaire by next Tuesday. Not being a total moron, I have of course done no such thing, but that doesn't stop the little buggers from calling my mobile phone about every 20 minutes. This is intensely irritating, interrupting, as it does, my time spent looking melancholic and wistful. Or walking the grounds and contemplating Greek philosophers. Or celebrating with the boys down the Hellfire Club. Or visiting Madame Coucher's House of Charms.
Well, hello, young lady.
Oh, for fuck! Or come to that, spending some quality time being hungover and hiding from her ladyship because I visited Madame Coucher's House of Charms. Now, the reality is, these little scroats and bottom feeders have been doing this sort of thing to all of us for years, stealing not just our mobile phone numbers, but our addresses, our dates of birth, our social security numbers, and anything else that they can get their little mitts on, and then flogging it off to individuals of dubious intent on the dark web. And if you think this isn't happening to you right now, sadly, I'm afraid you are kidding yourself. But the fine folks at Aura can help. Not, as I first supposed, by rounding up a group of sturdy-looking underkeepers, arming them with cudgels, and going to discuss the situation with your harassers, but instead by using their clever software. Because you see, whenever Bob the basement dweller puts your name, phone number, or other details onto the dark web, or heaven forbids tries to say access your bank account or credit cards, you'll get a ping from Aura. And in case it does all go sideways, they offer up to $5 million of identity theft insurance into the bargain. And that's a lot. I mean, that's got to be at least 60 quid? What's that, Jenkins? What do you mean we left the gold standard in 1931 and now the dollar's worth 75% of a pound? Why did no one tell me? Okay, well look, now's not the time. I've got a serious video to do. And next thing you'll be saying that the Labour government got into power. What? Oh my God, everybody look poor immediately. Sorry about that. Oh, where was I? Oh yes. So whilst Aura can't stop your assets being raided by overmighty politicians, it can stop them from being raided by other kinds of criminals. If you don't believe me, they offer you a 2-week free trial, which you can get by going to the link on the screen now and signing up. Honestly, I don't know why you wouldn't do this forthwith. Contractual obligations completed and new lead ordered for the east. An eco-solar pumping heaty thingy for the house in Scunthorpe that I definitely live in. Let us turn back to that group of absolute legends known today as the Chindits, or Special Force, or the Long Range Penetration Group. No sniggering at the back there, please, children. Just a quick aside. Note, I did mean Special Force and not Special Forces. A little like the missile that knows where it is because it knows where it isn't. Special Force was a Special Forces group known as Special Force, not a generic type of Special Forces. I hope that's cleared it all up. Moving swiftly along. Slight spoilers here, but the Chindits actually performed 2 separate operations. A smaller initial operation with 77th Infantry Brigade, known as Operation Longcloth in 1943, and a second, far larger mission, codenamed Operation Thursday in 1944. Today, we're going to talk about Longcloth, and when we come back in the next video, we'll talk about Thursday. They are widely lauded as amazing raids demonstrating enormous tactical flair, operational flexibility, and above all, superhuman courage and endurance, and frankly, rightly so. The guts of the men who fought in these campaigns beggars belief, operating for months behind Japanese lines, hounded and harassed constantly, having to carry all of their kit, suffering innumerable diseases and hardships, and moving hundreds and hundreds of miles across enemy country in staggering heat, with no hope of relief and without heavy weapons support, and in the certain knowledge that if they were wounded that they would die. Most, if not all of the men who fought this dark, painful, terrifying campaign carried the scars and the memories of these operations to their graves and were rightly proud of being Chindits. These were the bravest of the brave, and they deserve nothing but respect. However, the story we will cover today, that of Operation Longcloth, is a tragic one in many ways, with more than 30% of the 3,065 men who were deployed being killed or wounded, and another 30% being declared unfit for further service on their return. The second, far bigger, far longer campaign, Operation Thursday, which we will cover in detail next time, cost even more, both in absolute numbers and in percentage terms. And so one must ask oneself, did the ends justify the means? What strategic impact did they actually have? Were these operations, when all is said and done, worth all of the blood, treasure, support and trauma involved? And to start that discussion, I believe we need to start with the man who drove the entire operation to fruition, Orde Wingate. It is a fool's game to hold people from the past to the standards of today. They're always going to fall short. So when I say that Orde Wingate was, to use a correct medical term, as mad as a box of fucking frogs, I say it because plenty of his contemporaries thought that he was completely unhinged, and with good bloody reason. Orde was on a sticky wicket from the start, being born into a fundamentalist Christian cult called the Plymouth Brethren. In their UK form, they're about as close to Amish as one can get whilst living in a city, lacking the physical space that is available to US cultists who cut themselves entirely off from society. The Brethren in the UK hold themselves aloof from society, not accepting its norms and believing themselves to be saved, whilst being surrounded by a corrupt world, run on behalf of, or actually by, the devil, and whose influences must be constantly guarded against. So that's fun. Practically this meant, in Orde's case, that he was raised until he was about 16 on a steady diet of the Bible and stories about prophets getting persecuted for their views by evil figures of authority, something which may have had just the slightest impact on the course of the rest of his life. Somewhat surprisingly then, he was sent to Charterhouse School at 16.
Okay, sorry, look, this is post-production, Hard Thrasher here. I spotted this as a bit of an error. I just said there that Orde Wingate didn't go to Charterhouse until he was 16, which would have been quite unusual, because that would have put him into the sixth form, and everybody else would have been there for a few years before him. He didn't. He went in 1916, when he was 13. 13 is the normal age for entry into British public schools as a general rule. Yep, so sorry about that, screwed up. Hands up, there we go. Anyway, carry on.
As far as we can tell, both Wingate and Charterhouse were delighted to see him leave when he was 18. My personal feeling is that young men who have weird, staring eyes, a penchant for growing beards, and sprinkle their conversation liberally with obscure biblical quotes should not, if at all possible, be given access to His Majesty's heavy artillery. However, the fine folks of the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich felt otherwise, and Wingate was accepted as a cadet. In establishments where young men are isolated away from the world and left to their own devices, transgressions of social norms are inevitably met with some kind of cruel and unusual punishment, which often involves weird nakedness and a lot of pain. And Woolwich was no different. Junior cadets, deemed to have breached the rules set by senior ones, were stripped naked and made to run between lines of older men who would beat them with a knotted towel before the victim was thrown into a freezing butt of water. Inevitably, it didn't take very long until Wingate was selected as the next victim. But being the fearless weirdo that he was, he chose instead to preempt the whole thing by stripping himself down before they could get to him, walking slowly out of his room, stark bollock naked up to the line of senior boys, looking each of them in the eye and daring them to hit him, which of course they didn't. He then, in his birthday suit, sauntered down the line and threw himself into the butt of water. The line between psycho and brave is a fine one, and I'm not sure where this story really sits. For most of his life, Orde Wingate would, as River Phoenix put it, walk along the edge and kiss it with his toes. Wingate was clearly pretty bright and demonstrated an aptitude for languages, picking up Arabic and Hebrew quickly during his time at Woolwich. This made him ideal for his first posting to Sudan in 1928 and then to Palestine in 1935, serving under one Percival Wavell, future commander of the British forces in Burma. Probably one way to tell a lot about a person is looking at how they treat others. I, for example, enjoy evicting poor people from my lands and setting packs of dogs on the stragglers. Called me old-fashioned, but everybody needs a hobby. Orde was also different, and not necessarily in a good way. He met a woman called Peggy and pursued a romantic engagement with her. So far, so normal. However, this went on for 5 years. 5 years at a time when playing tennis with a woman was tantamount to declaring your intentions, and when being unmarried at 30 invited a lot of unwelcome questions about whether the man was, in fact, a friend of Dorothy. Eventually, he succumbed to the social pressure and, without telling Peggy, placed an advert in the Times announcing their engagement and setting the date of their marriage for when he was next back on leave. Peggy was, understandably, nonplussed by this, but accepted the positive turn of events. Unfortunately for Peggy, whilst on the boat back from Palestine to do the deed, he met the 16-year-old Lorna Patterson and her mother. In a very Wingatean moment, he decided that he'd fallen desperately in love with Lorna and proposed marriage on the spot. Lorna's mother told Orde that he would have to wait until Lorna was at least 18, which Orde accepted with the poor grace that was usual to his character. So far as we know, Orde never saw Peggy again. In the subsequent 2 years that he was forced to wait, Orde amused himself by writing a series of highly insulting and weird letters to his future mother-in-law, as you do. Frankly, my mother-in-law is wonderful, but even if she were an old bag, I'd quite like to keep banging her daughter, so I would at least be polite. But there you go. Meanwhile, his army career was, well, blossoming, sort of. This is the Orde Wingate Institute of Physical Education in Northampton. That's in Netayana in central Israel. And why, you might ask, is this institute, and indeed a lot of streets and schools and various other public buildings in Israel, named after Wingate? Why is his name connected with the foundation of the IDF, one might ask? Well, turns out Orde is, to this day, held up as one of the founding fathers of the Israeli Defense Force. Bet you didn't see that coming. Many evangelical sects hold that the Book of Revelation is a desirable description of a future that will usher in the kingdom of Jesus on earth. And if you follow what passes for logic in that statement through, then that means you need a massive battle to happen in Israel. And for that to happen, you have to have the Jewish people with their own homeland back. Look, I think this has a lot more to do with rye bread gone mouldy or special mushroom soup, but yeah, fine, whatever. This means some folks, like Orde, who are deeply Christian, have supported the Zionism movement to a frankly insane degree for the last couple of hundred years. And given his natural background levels of Zionism, Orde's fanatical nature, and his knowledge of Hebrew, it's perhaps not all that surprising that when he was posted to Palestine in 1935, it took him a hot second to tie up with the Jewish settlers' cause and the militant groups of Irgun and Haganah. Like, these guys were straight-up terrorists, let's not mess about, and Orde took one look at them and went, "Those are my boys." In short order, he established something called the Special Night Service, which, if you're versed in the use of the term special in the darker bits of British military history, well, it means exactly what you think it means. Paramilitary forces doing horrible things after dark with semi-official sanction, in this case the sanction of Percival Wavell. Orde took a group of Jewish British Army soldiers and a bunch of local Jewish men and drove them around at night terrorising Arabs suspected of resisting the wave of Zionist immigration. This included large-scale human rights violations from the basics, like just beating the shit out of them, to the intermediate, like mutilation, stabbing and flogging, to the advanced, like shooting, hanging and burning to death. But this wasn't all. Oh no. On one occasion, he exhorted his Jewish soldiers to dress up as Arabs, enter the Arab market at Haifa, and begin shooting randomly into the crowd. A crowd that was made up not of hardened Arab fighters, but of women, children, and stallholders, and about a dozen of them were killed. We know that he was involved in an Irgun attack on the Haifa oil refinery, which saw gang members throw grenades into a crowd of Arab workers. He passed intelligence to the Haganah too, allowing them to conduct raids against British checkpoints and barracks, and there is more than the hint that he may well have taken part in some of those raids personally. All this time, Wavell was acting as his protector, believing that the Special Night Service was doing great work suppressing the Arab rebellion and disbelieving the more extreme rumours. However, by 1938, Wavell had been replaced and Wingate's activities were coming to the fore. The Catholic Church and the British Army have a lot in common in some ways, and so it was that, rather than investigate the rumours of his abuses, he was simply sent somewhere that they thought that he could do little further harm. Thus it was, when most of the British Expeditionary Force was enjoying their beach holiday at sunny Dunkirk in the middle of 1940, Major Wingate was in charge of an anti-aircraft unit back in the UK, writing repeated and heartfelt letters to anybody that he thought that might listen about how British-backed Jewish armies should be raised in order to rule the Arabs in the Middle East. It didn't last, and over a year later, Wavell, who by this point had been made theatre commander for the Mediterranean and North Africa in February, decided to try calling on the young officer once more. This time the job was at least killing Italians in uniform. Well, mostly. Wingate, being Wingate, naturally reached to the Bible in order to name his new force, which he called Gideon Force, and decided to try and repeat what he'd done in Palestine, striking at night deep into enemy territory to spread terror and pain. But this being Wingate, of course, religion was never that far away, and he rapidly fell in with the cult in Ethiopia that held that their exiled emperor, Haile Selassie, was in fact a god, because, of course he did. So in fact, Wingate was kind of a proto-Rastafarian, but, white and tooled up to the nines and minus the medicinal Moroccan chocolate. Once again, though, the replacement of Wavell in June of 1941 was the end of Wingate's activities. He was sent to Cairo for fear that he might go completely native again and join the Abyssinians full-time. There, now suffering from malaria as well as his Messiah complex, he wrote a furious 9,000-word essay about how completely shit every aspect of the British Army in Ethiopia, and indeed all of Africa, was, including everyone who'd supported him, and tried to send it out across the British Empire. Now, commanding officers tend to frown on this sort of thing, and without Wavell being there for protection, Orde was highly exposed. When the Army High Command discovered what Wingate was up to, the report was, unsurprisingly, immediately suppressed, and Wingate was threatened with being put up on charges for gross insubordination. He responded to this with predictable self-pity and a complete inability to see how he'd actually caused the situation. He therefore resolved to do as self-obsessed pricks often do and attempted emotional blackmail by trying to kill himself with a hunting knife in a hotel room in Cairo. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at these things, the noise he made attracted the attention of the next-door neighbour, and Wingate was rushed to hospital and his life was saved. On recovering, Wingate claimed that it was justifiable self-homicide, so oppressed was he by the agents of Satan, by which he meant everyone who opposed him, including, of course, Wavell, that it was better to kill himself rather than risk falling further under their influence. Truly the reasoning of the totally sane. There is a certain irony to Wingate's pattern of rule-breaking and self-aggrandizement, which is that he was completely intolerant of even minor questioning by his inferiors of his orders and plans. He himself could be the great soldier doing God's work and questioning his orders whilst fighting against the satanic forces around him, but heaven forbid that any of his juniors ever question him. This inability to be self-critical or to hear criticism of his ideas meant that the operations he planned were totally focused around him, on him, by him, and him alone. No one else was ever allowed to contribute to the concepts he came up with, and therefore, spoilers, when he died, so did the vision of LRP. To round out this picture of a man, it's probably worth pointing out that he spent a good deal of his time not washing, doing his teeth, or bothering about his appearance in any way. If he was forced to wear clothes at all, his uniform was dirty, ripped, and never pressed. He sported a bizarrely oversized Wolsey hat, beard, and an alarm clock strapped to his wrist that would go off at random times for no apparent reason. He kept an onion on a string around his neck that he would occasionally munch on. He abhorred sports, especially ones playing with balls, believing that they risked causing infertility. In short, if you found him sleeping rough in an underpass, it wouldn't come as a huge surprise. This, then, was the measure of the man who thought he could retake Burma in 1943. When reading about the exploits of the Chindits, it's often said that Wingate had to fight hard against the conservative powers of the army to get his ideas approved, and this is in fact complete bullshit. In fact, Wavell and Slim and many other senior commanders were open to the idea both of long-range penetration-type missions and of irregular forces. But because Wingate felt it necessary as part of his personality to pitch himself like Elijah the prophet, speaking truth to power and offering a radically different vision of the world to come against the sinners that ruled the British Army, that view has largely been adopted by some of the lazier biographers out there. But even really a cursory glance down British military history shows how irregular forces were not just accepted, they were an integral part of the way that the British fought wars in multiple theatres, not least in India itself. Even as Orde was building his special night service in Palestine in the 1930s, the Toshi Scouts, a force of about 3,000 irregulars, were chasing the fakir of Ipi up and down the mountains of what is now northwest Pakistan, using irregular forces to fight an irregular war. In Burma itself, the British Army had developed something called V-Force, a mixture of Naga tribespeople, colonial planters, adventurers, eccentrics, and a number of others who came together to cause a complete pain in the ass to the Japanese, ambushing their patrols, reporting their attentions along the border, and manufacturing their own firearms. In the deserts of North Africa, the SAS had begun their long-range penetration missions before Japan had even entered the war, and a lot of this went back to the Boer War, where the British Army had observed that the Boers could be highly effective by creating what they referred to as commandos, and that is where we get the term commando from in the Second World War. None of this was particularly new. In fact, if you go back a little bit further, the idea of long-range penetration missions behind enemy lines to break supply routes and to distract from the main attack was hardly novel. It was a key function of the cavalry from at least the time of the 30 Years' War, and used in virtually every war since, not least the likes of Bedford Forrest and Benjamin Grierson during the US Civil War. The reason that Wingate got the support of officers including Wavell and Auchinleck and Mountbatten and Slim was precisely because these ideas were not that radical. But where he got opposition was when he tried to operate away from major land operations. The whole point of, say, the SAS in North Africa or Roundhead Cavalry during the English Civil Wars, that they were there to disrupt enemy movements towards the main body of the army, either to break up an enemy advance or facilitate an advance by friendly forces, and Wingate never really grasped this very basic requirement. Isolated from friendly forces, with no support, long-range patrols were hugely vulnerable to being isolated and destroyed, and their impact, due to their small numbers, could only ever be limited. I am not, as her ladyship is only too keen to point out, a details man. I generally couldn't give a monkey's that I know that the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Scottish Haggis Buggerers crossed the Numpty River on the 3rd of October 1956 and flanked right around the teapot carried by Mrs. Jenkins at number 54. All of that sort of thing tends to send me off into a dyslexic haze of confusion and anger, but sadly in this case I must include some base detail. So let us treat this like the awful nastiness between man and wife, a perfunctory, practical thing which we will get through as quickly as we can. Orde was given for this first little adventure a group of different Indian and British Army units cobbled together into a brigade. These included the 13th Battalion King's Liverpool Regiment, the 3rd Battalion 2nd Gurkha Rifles, the 2nd Burma Rifles, known as Tuberif, and a mule company transport to carry all their stuff, as well as 142 Commando Company to provide, and I quote here, bangs and flashes, basically to blow shit up. Attached to these forces were then 8 RAF air liaison sections, who I'm sure were completely delighted with the news that they would be accompanying the poor bloody infantry on their little yomp through the jungle, and then a brigade signal section from the Royal Corps of Signallers, who presumably had all offended their commanding officers in some non-specific but quite horrific way. Aside from 142, these were bog-standard British and Indian Army troops, and none of them had volunteered for the job at hand. These forces were divided into columns imaginatively numbered 1 to 8 of about 400 men each, plus mules and a handful of commandos. The idea was that these columns would operate separately to stretch out enemy defenders, but closely enough that they could, at least in theory, come together to aid one another in the event that one got bogged down in a fight. Initially labelled as Special Force or 77th Infantry Brigade, Wingate wanted a better name for his force, something that his men could get behind, and he decided to use the Burmese word for the lions that protect the many Buddhist temples in the area. Unfortunately, he got the word wrong, calling his force Chindits rather than Chinthe, the correct term. In typically Wingatian style, when this was pointed out to him, he simply said, "Well, Chinthe doesn't make any sense in English." Okay? To get the various units up to speed, Wingate lent heavily on Mike Calvert's bush warfare training staff, who, until they were unceremoniously ejected from Burma by the advancing Japanese, had established something of a reputation as the toughest training outfit in Southeast Asia. The regime Wingate decided to use for his training regime basically involved enough exercise to make even the most sadistic PT instructor weep tears of joy, but not a lot else. Brutally long training marches into central India meant 12 to 15-hour days in columns operating in total silence, often without cooking fires when they did stop, covering 100 to 150 miles in an exercise. These were augmented with navigation and river crossing practice and dispersal and regrouping exercises. Of course, many men did not make the cut. Wingate washed out about 40% of the King's Own as an example, but then he realised he actually needed the numbers, so he was sent an equal number of new recruits who, of course, had never done the training, so that went well. Overall, the rates of diseases were catastrophically high throughout training because basics, like for example issuing mepicrine tablets to control malaria, were not sorted out. And some pretty basic skills, like for example battle drills that were being rolled out in the rest of Eastern Army, were completely ignored. Consequently, troops did not practice or even know the theory of movements like advance to contact, retreating contact, setting up or breaking from an ambush, operating with ground attack aircraft, mortar work or escape an invasion. Neither did they have any practice trying to live off the jungle. Everything they needed was supposed to be dropped to them, but if it went wrong, as it frequently was bound to do so, there was no plan B or even thought of what plan B might look like. Most bizarrely, given their complete reliance on the air link, they only did one air supply practice run during the entirety of their training. A lot of this came down to Wingate and Calvert's total inexperience in training large formations of troops. Neither of them have ever done anything like this before, but frustratingly, neither of them was capable of admitting to anyone else that they needed any kind of help. Columns 1 and 2, known together as Group Number 1, were made up predominantly of the 3rd and 2nd Gurkha Rifles and a battalion of the Royal Scots under the command of one Lieutenant Colonel Alexander, and it was supposed to have about 1,000 men and operate in the southern area. They were to go in early, headed roughly for Yuan, then they were to cross the Chindwin and thus act as a diversion. If it was able to carry on, the number 1 was supposed to cross the Mu River and head towards Mitmong, blowing up the Mandalay-Mitkina Railway on the way before returning back to India. Columns 3 to 8, known as Group Number 2, would act as the northern group, following about a week to 10 days behind Number 1 group. Comprised of approximately 2,000 men under Lieutenant Colonel S.A. Cook, this was the main body. However, that 2,000 men really was an on-paper figure. The training was so harsh that, for example, Column 5 had to be completely disbanded, able to report just 45 out of 400 men fit for service. And the other columns within Number 2 fared little better, a number of them going in at barely 75% strength. This wasn't a great start, but worse was to come. The plan was that they were going to cross both the Chindwin and the Irrawaddy and head for Indore, picking off targets of opportunity as they did so, before looping round and returning to India. Both groups would need to march between 200 and 300 miles, including crossing of the hills of the Naga Range, hills that the Japanese had taken one look at and were like, fuck that noise, we're staying in Burma. All 3,000 men would be relying on the might of the RAF for supplies, to wit, 3 Hudsons and 3 DC-3s, which was all the RAF could scrape together at the time. If any of them got shot down or diverted or suffered mechanical issues, the men would run out of food and starve. Originally, all of this was to support Operation Ravenous, a combined British, Chinese and American strike into northern Burma from Lido to reopen the Burma Road. Unfortunately, and perhaps unsurprisingly, when Stilwell said that he had 4 divisions ready to attack, what he actually meant was that he'd asked Scheck for 4 divisions, and Scheck had said no. And then he'd asked Washington for 4 divisions, and they'd also said no, so Stilwell had gone off in a huff. The British then had subsequently decided on the much more modest drive down into the Arakan that we talked about back in episode 3, and Slim had planned to use Wingate to operate down the Caladan Valley to cover his flank. However, Slim had then been removed as the operations commander, being replaced by Noel Incompetence Irwin, a man not given regular custody of his family's brain cell, who really couldn't see the value of Wingate's force in this new, much stupider operational plan. And this suited both Wingate and Wavell rather well, because it allowed Wavell to tell the Americans that he was going to do something to open the Burma Road, and it allowed Wingate to have free hand to do basically whatever the fuck he wanted. If anybody had actually stopped to think for a moment at this point, they would surely have asked what the raid was actually supposed to be achieving. After all, the Americans now weren't coming. Wingate argued that they were going to go and hit Japanese supply columns, but supply columns to where, why, and to what end was never really elucidated upon. Having assumed always that the Japanese would see him as the major threat in the area, Wingate then indulged in a little bit of theatrical subterfuge, dressing up a major in his uniform and attaching him to the number 1 group HQ because, well look, I've got no real clue. Apparently the Japanese were supposed to hear that the great Orde Wingate had gone in with number 1 group, and this would make it seem like the main effort or something. In reality, of course, the Japanese had never heard of Wingate. They hadn't got a clue what was going on, a situation that didn't really change until after the raid. Operation Longcloth began then on the 8th of February 1943, and on the 13th they crossed the Chindwin River. I mean, I make that sound bloody easy. In reality, it was a fricking nightmare. The training hadn't really included serious river crossings, and the kit that they brought with them failed. The mules wouldn't budge, and both groups lost more than 2 days trying to get over it. Getting back, potentially with the Japanese on their tails, would be next to impossible. The Japanese were, to put it mildly, somewhat confused as to exactly what the British were up to. There were no significant lines of communication that couldn't quickly and easily be fixed, and no strategically important objectives, just a lot of isolated occupation garrisons in the area in which the Chindits were operating. Consequently, most of the columns didn't actually see any signs of any Japanese for days at a time. In his subsequent report on the operations of the 77th Infantry Brigade, Wingate put this lack of Japanese opposition down to them running away. Sure, whole Japanese divisions did that the whole time throughout the war, as we all know. It wasn't until the 1st of March, nearly a month into the operation, and after some 200 miles of marching, that the first successful ambush was actually conducted. Total Japanese dead, approximately 5. Over the next 4 weeks, the Japanese moved troops into the operating areas, figured out where the British were and that they were being supplied by air, and began to tighten the noose around the columns, using about 9 battalions of troops in all. That's roughly 9,000 men against Wingate's on-paper strength of about 3,000. But actually, because each column was operating independently, the Japanese enjoyed overwhelming numerical superiority and, of course, the full plethora of modern firepower, most importantly proper artillery, which could easily outrange anything that the Chindits could bring to bear. Columns 2 and 4 were both ambushed by the Japanese forces and essentially destroyed in the process, with the survivors falling back across the Chind Wind by the 3rd of March, and removing roughly 25% of the Chindits' entire strength in the process. Column 8 was likewise ambushed, but managed to disperse and reform for the loss of just 16 men. On the 6th of March 1943, Column 3 blew up the bridge near the Nankan railway station and then managed to conduct the largest-scale ambush of the entire operation, killing a further 15 Japanese, and blowing up a series of bridges over their line of march and generally making a right nuisance of themselves. This naturally attracted the attention of the Japanese forces in the area, who, from then on, were constantly hunting the columns under Wingate. Despite this, Wingate decided to try and cross the Irrawaddy and penetrate deeper into Burma, which, given how badly wrong the crossings of the Chindwin had gone, was frankly bloody stupid, and not only because Column 3 was caught in the act and badly cut up, but because it would mean having to cross back over the Irrawaddy, now with the Japanese in hot pursuit. The crossings of the various columns were aided a great deal by local villagers who helped with things like just carrying stuff, loading things onto ferries, and of course corralling the mules, a fact not unnoticed by the Japanese forces, who then proceeded to wipe those villages out in Wingate's wake. Finding that there was little water and a fuck ton of Japanese on the other side of the Irrawaddy, the columns milled around for a few days before pressure from the Japanese and the realization that his men were really exhausted by now forced Wingate to order a general withdrawal. They then attempted to recross the Irrawaddy on the 26th of March, but the Japanese hit several columns just as they were in the middle of the movement, a process made much slower now by the lack of local help thanks to the Japanese revenge raids. After several near misses, including Column 7 getting badly cut up, Wingate gave the order for the columns to further subdivide and make their own way back to India. This wasn't quite an every man for himself order, but it was bloody close to one. The next month saw superhuman efforts by small bands of men to escape back into India, and by the 1st of June, 2,000 of the original 3,000 were back. The operation had seen some 30% of the force wiped out, and over the subsequent days it became clear that something like 70% of the survivors were unfit for further service, suffering from disease, starvation and trauma, meaning that in the end only 603 men of the original 3,056 continued with the army. Wingate assumed that he would be court-martialed for the failure. But there were benefits to Longcloth beyond the minimal material damage done to the Japanese and the losses incurred, thanks to the army PR staff in Delhi. The raid was heralded as a great success, very publicly, just as the first Arakan campaign was descending into abject failure. It acted as a wonderful boost to morale to the army as a whole, and ordinary troops were seen to be beating the Japanese in a fight, very publicly and very broadly, and this was very useful. Less publicly, but more importantly, it also proved that air supply was possible, albeit only with air superiority, and it proved to the Americans that the British would indeed fight, which was seriously important at this moment in the wider war. The costs had been horrific. Even with the wider political impact included, it's hard to say that Longcloth was anything other than an abject failure, tactically and strategically, and nor can one really look past the cost of the men who took part. Because no provision had been made for wounded men to be extracted, columns were forced to choose between trying to carry them out or, more realistically, to kill their own wounded to prevent them from falling into Japanese hands. But nonetheless, some 200 were later rounded up by the Japanese Kempeitai and intelligence officers in the coming weeks, and through a combination of torture and brutal treatment of local villagers, a picture of what had happened was put together by Japanese services. All of which proved incredibly useful to one specific commander, Lieutenant General Reina Mutaguchi in Rangoon, and his superior, General Kawabe in Saigon. The Naga Hills near Imphal were not impenetrable to troops, it turned out. Far from it. And anything that the British could do, surely the Imperial Japanese Army could do far, far better. Wingate now basked in the unexpected public adulation, but he was conscious that Wavell had been promoted to Viceroy of India, and that meant, once again, his old protector wasn't there when he was most needed, and should anyone look too closely, they might realise what a fucking disaster the whole thing had been. Thus Orde set about writing one of the great historical works of fiction of all time, known as the after-action report of the 77th Infantry Brigade, which, thanks to £80 spent on the world's most expensive photocopying by the National Archives, I now have my very own copy of, and it's quite the read. If you'd like to read it too, I will put it up and make it available to my patrons after this video goes out. Normally this sort of thing would get passed to Delhi HQ, where it would be summarised into a paragraph or two and then sent up the chain and thence into obscurity. But this is Orde, so naturally he sent an unedited version to Churchill's private secretary. So impressed was Churchill by this young brigadier's ideas and his apparent success that Wingate was ordered to become an escort, in almost every sense of the term. He was in fact included in Churchill's retinue to the Quebec Quadrant Conference in August 1943, there to be shown off to the US top brass. Fortunately, Wingate hadn't quite cottoned on, seeing this as a vindication of his tactics, which it was, but wholly missing the political play that Churchill was making, e.g. the Brits can and will fight, we just need the material resources to do it with. The US top brass was therefore presented with Orde in full flow on how he was the only man who knew how to fight the Japanese in the jungles of Burma. This sort of absolute certainty and aggression to get at the enemy was music to the Americans' ears, just as it was to Churchill, and they fell in love with this weird little Englishman. At the end of it, Churchill paid off his escort, promoting Orde to Major General, and then packed the little weirdo back off to Burma, leaving Mountbatten, the Ork and Slim to try and perform the unpleasant clearing up operation. Thus, after what Slim politely described as vigorous debate, a second, much larger operation was greenlit, which we will come to next time. Enamoured with Wingate, the Americans now asked him to train their shiny new 5307th Composite Unit, better known as Merrill's Marauders or Galahad Force. And you will be surprised to find out, I'm quite sure, that Stilwell and Wingate hate each other basically on sight. Nonetheless, with the political situation in Chongqing now a little bit strained in that Czech was seriously contemplating having Stilwell whacked, perhaps this moment was a good one for Joe to lead an expedition to, you've guessed it, reopen the Burma Road, and so he, Galahad Force, the Chinese 22nd and 28th Division, cooked up a plan to strike south and take the town of Midkina on the Chinese border. This would help cut the hump flight distance and eventually allow for a new Lido road to connect India to China. The Americans wanted the Chindits operating behind the Japanese lines to support this thrust. Wingate assumed that he was going to train the 5307th and then add them to his force, but again you will be shocked to discover that Stilwell was more likely to turn into a communist than to let a Brit command US troops, so they were recalled to Lido forthwith, and Joe got ready to start a march-in. And there we are going to leave things for today. When we come back, we will consider answers to the question, how could this possibly go wrong? Ladies, gentlemen, and the otherwise fabulous, thank you for getting to the end of this video. I genuinely appreciate the fact that you've taken time out to watch my offerings. It really does mean a lot to me. So do feel free to slip into something more comfortable, pour yourself a nice cup of cocoa, and enjoy the inner glow that comes from having done a good deed. I hope those of you who have got this far and not been sidelined by making angry comments or turning it off in disgust recognise that this is really not supposed to be an ad hominem attack on Wingate. I can respect Wingate's courage and tenacity to try and follow through his ideas and his willingness to speak truth to what he saw as power. However, I believe he was both fundamentally misguided and very naive, and that he lacked the basic human empathy which made him something of a sociopath, incapable of really relating to his men or anyone around him. And I hope it goes without saying that I have nothing but deep respect for those men who fought and served in this first intake of Chindits. Their valour and courage is not in question. When we come back next time, we will see what the successors did in Operation Thursday, look at how the Japanese responded, and sadly talk about that one time we gave that wank puffin Vinegar Joe command of troops in the field. Until then, peace, love, and jelly babies. Sorry. Look, me again. This is a completely unscripted bit at the end of the video because I realised that there were a few things which I'd forgotten to say, which I really should have said during the course of that. In the hurry to try and get the thing done and to make sure that I got the story out and to divide the video up, I neglected to mention a few bits, and most crucially of which is a huge thank you to my patrons who made this video possible, which allows me to do things like, for example, go and get from the archives, National Archives, a copy of 77th Infantry Brigade's reporting. It's incredibly useful to me to go and buy the books I needed to do this series with. I realise that that's not everybody's speed, and if you just want to hit subscribe, then feel free to do that, or hit like, or whatever. But if you really want to support me, but you don't want to give money to Patreon, I've got a wish list which I put together on Amazon. I did it, to be honest, as a little bit of fun, and a couple of individuals have taken it rather seriously, for which I thank them, actually, because what it allows me to do is to say, look, these are the books that I want to go off and go and read. Would you mind awfully buying me a copy? Because it helps my my financial situation no end. If you can do that, you want to do that, then feel free to do so. Equally, put a couple of bottles of whiskey on there, and somebody rather wonderfully bought me one, so I wasn't expecting it. It was a bit of a joke. Thank you to whoever you are. Thank you. If you do buy something off the list, for goodness sakes, make sure you sign it in the gift box so I know who to say thank you to. Other than that, we're going to come back again and we're going to start to look at the admin box and the fighting Kohima and Imphal. This is actually really quite complicated and difficult to do, so I thought originally we were going to try and do this in sort of one or maybe two videos. I think the reality is I'm probably going to have to break it up into a number of different parts. I might just do one, which is just the order of battle and the battle plan, because it is quite complicated. But look, that will be coming along after we've done the second half of the Chindits. So for now, thank you. Thank you once again for having made it to the end of this. Thank you for listening to the addended bit of the Survivors Club and for the unscripted piece at the end here. And I look forward to seeing you all back here very, very soon. Thank you and goodbye.